When I was younger, although there was disagreement between the political parties, there was some agreement on what forward meant. The Democrats pulled forward and to the left, the Republicans forward and to the right. And though it may have seemed inefficient, we accepted that this was the cost of compromise to have a democracy. Bomb threats were unheard of in US politics. That was a third world problem. Over time, though, the definition of forward has changed with less agreement. When we switch administrations, one side thinks they now have the opportunity to solve the country's problems, starting with undoing the prior administration's policies. For those whose side lost power, there's a perception that the country is going backward. An old sense of, well, I think we could have done it better, but at least we made a little progress on a few things, is diminishingly rare. I'm reminded of a tug-of-war. On field day in high school, auto shop freshmen might challenge carpentry freshmen. When one side started to lose, sophomores jumped in. Then on the other side, then the juniors and seniors. Sometimes other shops would choose sides. The losers seemed to be the lawn, which got torn up worse by more people involved, at least up until the year the rope broke. It seems like something similar has happened to politics in America over my lifespan, and we're on the verge of our democracy breaking. Only you can't just go down to the marina and buy a new democracy, like we can with the rope. Some of this may be polarization or perceived polarization, driven by the internet, but I think some of it really is policy differences. It seems like this really hasn't been working well for a while now, and is only getting more intense with each administration change. Moderates don't like our direction either. Liberals don't like anything conservatives do, nor do conservatives like anything liberals do, but moderates are frustrated with the deadlock and dysfunction and diminishing progress forward on any issues. In a moderate's eyes, imperfect progress that we could settle on, so we could move on to new issues that need resolution, would be better than expending tremendous effort to stay stagnant, as we seem to do now. As I narrate this, we're a month into the second Trump administration. Leading into the inauguration, Trump was busy making cabinet picks, while Democratic-leaning states prepared to defend their citizens' rights from a feared onslaught of regressive policies. Now that he's in, he's pushing his agenda with executive orders as fast as he can, while the Dems half-heartedly try to stem the tides of change he wants to bring on. And meanwhile, Elon Musk is busy dismantling as much as he can, as fast as he can, with reckless abandon. His MO seems to be fire first and ask questions later. I'm reminded of my younger, hotshot programmer self. Reading code whose purpose I didn't understand, I would dismiss it as crappy code written by somebody who didn't know what they were doing. Occasionally true, but my older, wiser self instead starts by expecting I don't know something's purpose, so I research what it was originally for. Doing so avoids the trouble and consequences created by ill-conceived changes based on incomplete understanding, and the churn that results from these mistakes. Watching Musk's actions in light of that painfully earned wisdom, I wonder if this is the rope finally breaking. In the aftermath of the election, the Trump 2.0 administration's cabinet and leadership picks have received death threats. Meanwhile, the state of Connecticut's Democratic representatives, both House and Senate, received bomb threats signed MAGA. Maybe the internet exaggerates or accelerates the divide, but it's no longer limited to talk online. The trajectory we are on does not bode well for peaceful enjoyment of our lives. So what can we do about it? In February 2023, Marjorie Taylor Greene suggested a national divorce. The idea got poo-pooed at the time, but it stuck in my head. She's not the only one. Texas, through the years, has occasionally grumbled about seceding because of liberal policy oversteps. A movement alternately called the Texas Secession Movement, Texas Independence, Texas National Movement, or more simply, TEXIT. And recently, this Canadian guy on YouTube floated the idea of Canada getting in on a redefinition, with the prairie provinces joining up with the US Midwest because of shared geologies, industries, cultures, and economic interests. Similarly, Canada's coastal provinces have more in common with the US coastal states than the heartland. Since Trump seems interested in making Canada the 51st state, well, prairie provinces, would you actually be interested in becoming states if you could get away from those idiots in Ottawa? Buyer beware, though. I'm not sure the replacement idiots are any better, and the healthcare system definitely isn't. Joking aside, though, what are the benefits, disadvantages, challenges, and side effects of such a national divorce? What problems can it solve, and what can't it? There is no precedent for this in the US history. The last time a group of states tried to leave, we had a civil war with around 1 million dead, if we include civilian casualties. But if we cast our glance wider, we see Britain's exit from the European Union, or Brexit. It wasn't fast or easy, but it did happen without bloodshed. Could we do that? Well, that depends. Is there a reason for us to stay together? If we listen to the propagandists, it's a valid question. Fox News, for example, has made it clear that the blue states offer little to the Union. They are simply havens for illegal immigrants, crime and welfare recipients, and other needy folk who don't want to work. All those hardworking folk in red states are paying to support those lazy bums. There's no point in me challenging this narrative, because if I do, the believers will dismiss me as uninformed or providing malicious misinformation. So, assuming what Fox News says is true, why would red states want to stay in a relationship with this needy, Dem-run bastions of iniquity? On the flip side, Democrats are often described as a bunch of intellectual elites who look down on the hard-working farmers, miners, and construction workers as simpletons who are too stupid to understand the world or its politics, and that Dems perceive them as gullible fools who do whatever their priests and pundits tell them to. Assuming any of this is true, why would blue states want to collaborate with fools and idiots? We're divided over religion's roles in our country as well. There's a portion of Christians who believe that the United States was forged by its founders to be a Christian nation, and that the way forward is for us to return to a strict Christian life. They perceive the government as run by atheists and agnostics who are out to strip them of their freedom of religious expression. The rest of us, atheists and agnostics, sure, but also the religious people who don't want other religions telling us the right way to practice our religion, appreciate the separation of church and state, and many of us worry about its gradual erosion by those that want to bind their religious beliefs with politics and government. So given all of that, let's take some time to contemplate this idea of a national divorce. Let's start with the argument 4. Differing views of the best future aren't new, they've existed my whole life. But the scale and expression of that difference has changed. Although there was debate in the 1980s over the best economic policy, the debate was over the strengths and weaknesses in different policies, not over the people making the policies. In this latest election, the fight was over who was the wannabe dictator versus the enemy within, and whether their supporters were fascists or vermin. In the 1980s, politicians successfully worked to address the hole in the ozone layer, even when they disagreed on the economy. There wasn't a winner-take-all mentality, like running our country is a game of sports ball. Compromise wasn't a dirty word, instead a sign that both sides came together to find a solution that everyone could live with. By George W. Bush's administration, the internet was mainstream, cable news had become partisan, and compromise was on its way out. I observed in 2001 that pushing harder to enforce our desired way of life is only threatening someone else who, in turn, pushes harder. The result is an unbounded escalation. This escalation has continued for the 24 years since my observation. Compromise is ever more rare. The national conversation has devolved into name-calling, blame, and scapegoating, which is getting ever more hostile. Many have speculated that we're heading into another civil war. These days, there are conservatives that are convinced liberals can't wait to lock them up and take their guns away, that we want to take away their trucks and make them live in 15-minute cities, that we're mind-controlling them with vaccines, and that kids are being sex-changed at school in one day, that we're trying to make saying Merry Christmas illegal and outlaw Christianity. Liberals, meanwhile, are worried that conservatives are coming for our science-based healthcare, public schools, women's rights, black rights, queer rights, and to take away religious freedom and impose Christianity. And given some of Trump's election rhetoric, there's nervousness that sooner or later it could escalate into some Nazi shit. As a people, We have become divided, and we become more so with each passing year. It is turning angry, paranoid, and fearful. We are at each other's throats constantly, worried the opposition is coming for us. Even for those that would prefer to ignore it, to duck their heads and let the radicals fight it out, it's becoming impossible to find peace. Is anyone happy living like this? Ending up in a war seems like a possible outcome. In fact, unless something changes the trajectory of our growing incompatibility, it seems inevitable. But spilling blood over differing policy visions seems excessive? If this isn't working, why not try something else? Why not opt to break up, to have a national divorce? To quote our own Declaration of Independence, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever a form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." A national divorce would let the Republican-led states go off and do whatever Christian and nationalist things they idealize, while the Democratic-run states can go crazy with DEI initiatives and healthcare for all. Run the experiment and see what happens. As divorcees, each is insulated from the problems and bad decisions the other creates. In our polarized world, confident we're right and they're wrong, we can all sit back and relax and enjoy seeing those other guys run themselves into the ground. When the day arrives that they come back crying for help, we'll think about it. Or maybe both sides survive, producing two very different countries with different lifestyles and political systems. Whatever the outcome, at least it'll unburden us of the problems those other SOBs are creating for us right now. The crux of the argument for dividing is simply, this ain't working. We all know it. The question is, do we deal with it? Problems avoided have a tendency to grow into larger problems. So unless something changes, sooner or later, this is going to break. Wouldn't it be better to address the problem now and divide peacefully, rather than wait until it comes apart violently later? The best reason to go our separate ways is our lives will be better separate. But would that actually be the case? First, there's the matter of divvying up our assets. From land to debts, there are difficult decisions ahead if we're to break up. Looking at a 2024 election results map, we have this large chunk of liberal-leaning states in the Northeast and another on the West Coast. Colorado and New Mexico are outliers, liberal areas in a sea of red. What the map doesn't show are the swing states. Nevada in the West, a few states along the Great Lakes, and a few along the red-blue border in the Northeast. The conservative states are contiguous, so they can form a single country. I think Texas would stay if they were hooking up with other conservative states, though there's a chance they might want to go it alone. The liberal-leaning states are split up, so how would that work? The answer is, I don't know. This is one of the many details that would need to be worked out. The two obvious options would be all exiters forming a single new country, or the West Coast forming one country and the East Coast another. Swing states could opt into remaining or join the exiters, or maybe they'd reject both sides and form their own nation of swingers. Not that kind of swingers. Considering Brexit took 5 years, a national divorce will not be fast. It will take years to hammer out all the details. Consider our existing national debt. We'll need to figure out how to divide that. Evenly between the states, based on population, based on current representation, stuff that needs to be negotiated. What about Social Security? Do we just divide the country and each region takes care of those living there? How do we deal with it if people want to move between countries in the future? Are we going to have a closed border with custom checkpoints like between us and Canada? Or open borders, like between member states in the European Union? Are we going to use the same currency? Who gets Washington, D.C.? And who has to make a new capital? And it's not just money. How do we divide our military and our weapons? Who gets the nukes? The GPS system that our navigation systems rely on, including modern farm tractors, it was put there by the military. If we split, Is it going to be maintained? And by whom? Similarly, there's NOAA's weather satellites that tell us what's coming so we can be prepared for hurricanes, tornadoes, and other extreme weather. Can we live without that? I'm going to stop there because I could go on all day with how-to questions. There are a lot of details that need to be worked out, and the more I think about it, the more I find. And I suspect I'm just scratching the surface. Dividing the country will not be fast or easy. But if this ain't working, what's the option? And if it's going to happen anyway, why wait? Why not get it done now and avoid the pain and trouble of trying to save a dying marriage? And for Republican-leaning states, there's no time like the present. Master negotiator Donald Trump can helm this thing for them. If he's a third of the businessman he's purported to be, the blue states will be totally fucked by whatever deal he can negotiate. But he ain't going to live forever, so if you want him on that job, Republicans, there's no time like the present. But before we do that, let's consider some reasons to stick together. Or, as the Declaration of Independence phrased it, prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light of transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. As one country, the United States is a powerhouse. We have a 250-year history, and our dollar is the world's reserve currency. That is, the currency that other countries use to trade between nations. Being the reserve currency is a privilege, blessing the dollar with additional strength and value. Being the incumbent benefits the dollar in a way that encourages it to stay the reserve currency. But that isn't a certainty. The BRICS currencies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and a handful of smaller countries, have formed their own banks so they can avoid the dollar. Although liquidity swaps, that's international bankers speak for a loan, via the BRICS contingent reserve are still done with dollars, showing the power of the dollar. And to be fair, losing reserve currency status is a fringe worry that's been bandied about by amateur economists for years, citing chaotic politics and economic policies, debts, and deficits. But established economists dismiss the idea, because although BRICS would love to do it, the dollar is just too established and safe versus any alternative. Increasing isolationism, hinting we might pull out of NATO, increasing budget deficits, running up even more debt, threats of wars, and discussing disbanding the FDIC can't help. But these are probably not enough on their own. Although Trump did bluster about retaliation should the BRICS bloc try to undermine the dollar, giving these worries an air of legitimacy they never really had before. And splitting the country? What is the full faith and credit of these United States if we are to break up? The safety established by our 250-year history will assuredly take a hit. Is it enough to end our dollar's term as the reserve currency? I can't say, but it's another nail in a coffin that already seems to have a lot of nails in it. For decades, the US has been there to help up-and-coming countries get started. This benefited US businesses that get contracts or made loans to these countries. Sometimes we gained access to minerals or other resources, and when those countries grew up, our investments shaped those nations into allies and toward democracies, at least when we weren't installing dictators to get cheap oil or bananas. Our assistance wasn't out of the goodness of our heart, it was out of self-interest. And yes, sometimes our involvement turned out to be badly invested. But other times, it was profitable for US businesses. To be fair, I doubt much of that trickled down to you or me, but that's a different problem. With a return to isolationism, the US isn't going to do much of that anymore, acting like we can make it on our own. So China has stepped in with its Belt and Road Initiative and other projects. Guess who's making money on loans, expertise, contracts, and equipment sold to today's up-and-coming? Who shapes those countries' growth? Who will those countries want to ally and trade with as they grow? At the same time we're not cultivating new allies, we're threatening to withdraw from NATO and leave our existing allies to fend for themselves. Would you want to be our ally right now? Would you consider us someone good to ally with, given our whimsy over whether or not to be there for our existing allies? For decades, our NATO membership has discouraged Russian expansionism. Maybe they could take us on. Maybe they could take on Europe. But as long as we're united, Russia isn't inclined to try anything. Russia and China aren't the best of friends, but neither is fond of us. China is happy to take our money and buy our debt, but they'd prefer to be fully in charge of Asian politics without our interference. The more we isolate ourselves, the less leverage we have against either of these two, especially if they ally. If China gets restless, what might we lose in the Pacific or Southeast Asia, especially if we've driven our allies away or just abandoned them? What are we going to do if Russia decides it wants Alaska back? There's a lot of oil up there, and it affords us a lot of energy independence. It would be a ballsy move that I doubt Russia would take on its own, but if Russia and China were both interested in economically hurting the US where it counts, it would be a strategic move to take away our Alaskan oil. The attraction to breaking up is like an impulse buy, an easy solution that appeals to our emotions. But when we pause to consider, it's neither easy nor fast to accomplish. And since I've already J.J. Abrams this video up with that, let's add some M. Night Shyamalan and consider another flaw in this analysis from the very beginning, the idea that there are red states and blue states. Here's the state of New York. In presidential elections of late, we always go blue. But when we look inside, the whole state isn't blue. The cities are, but the rural areas lean red. And when we look at the state of Iowa, which goes for Republican presidents, the larger cities lean Democrat. Nebraska? They've only got one city large enough to be blue, but there it is. California? Texas? Connecticut? Tennessee? The divides that are getting in our way are not state divisions, but rural versus urban divisions. And I think that's an important distinction because, 1, dividing by state isn't going to fix the underlying divisions. 2, it gives us a framework to consider why we desire different things. And 3, from that framework, we can start to consider each other's perspectives and how we need to accommodate each other instead of endlessly tearing each other apart. Even if we do proceed with a national divorce, it won't entirely eliminate the differing needs of cities versus rural areas. That's true in both conservative and liberal-leaning states. To break up or not to break up, we're back at the question we started with. Despite it sounding like a tempting solution, it's got a lot of downsides, and splitting would neither be fast nor easy to do. But neither is fixing the broken, dysfunctional politics of these united states. Whether we remain one or split into many, we would all benefit from understanding the things that are dividing us, that we might fix them in whatever form of government the future brings. So in coming videos, I'll be taking deep dives into some of the divisive issues that are often framed as liberal versus conservative, but are actually rural versus urban, to see if we can transform these from unresolvable disputes into an understanding that can be worked with, to find compromises or differing solutions. I think I'll start next time on guns. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing, as I do this in my spare time and it may be a little while. If you think the ideas presented here are worth thinking about, consider giving it a like so it's offered to others. Thanks for watching.